Hello, I'm Annette Oltmans. I'm founder and CEO of the Men Project. And in this workshop titled Spotlight on Coercive Control, Empowering Parents and Children in Coercive Control Situations, you're going to learn about your role as the protective parent and how you can help your child without disparaging the coercively controlling parent. You'll also learn how to calm your child's fears and their concerns while improving your attachment to the child, which is so important. And we'll cover so much more. Coercive control, what is it? It has multiple meanings. So I'd like to take a few minutes to define the way that we view it and what it can look like before we talk about how it impacts children. Coercive control is a strategic, ongoing, and increasing use of controlling behaviors to establish an unequal power dynamic in a relationship. And it can be really difficult to identify. It is nuanced, and it's hard to recognize what's happening to the one who's being harmed. Many tactics are used, and while the victim may know something is off, they can't readily make sense of what it is. Some of the tactics used are manipulation, intimidation, and various forms of gaslighting. We have a comprehensive list of terms and definitions on our website that outline these covert style behaviors that it gives them a name and a definition to really help you identify the patterns that are happening. So coercive control is not always covert or hidden. It can be overt as well, or a more obvious form of control. Coercive control encompasses all forms of abuse. For example, psychological abuse, including verbal insults and assaults, financial abuse, where funds are tightly controlled, sexual abuse, for example, through sexual coercion or ignoring the victim's preferences or requests, emotional abuse, which can look like inciting fear through pounding on a wall or harming an animal. It can, and it's not always to that extreme, but it can happen in physical abuse, such as grabbing an arm or restraining somebody or pulling hair. And it's seen in technological abuse with stalking and tracking by cameras and other means. Coercive control also takes place when there is legal abuse and the use of children in the court system. Ultimately, the imbalance of power that is created through these tactics is intentionally and systemically used to diminish the other's autonomy and agency, even to the point of harming the other in order to sustain the need for control. It's a pattern of behavior, and the goal is to control the way the victim sees and feels about themselves, to power over them, to manipulate outcomes, whether it's in conflicts or in just regular negotiations. And it's all meant to benefit the abuser's need for ultimate control. And these controlling motives can be over minor issues or major issues. Those who are harmed by coercive control may also be told that what they are and are not allowed to do during the day, or the foods they can and cannot eat, and what they're allowed to wear. It's not always this, but it sometimes stretches into this category. The victim may be prevented from getting health care and may experience things like being locked out of their home or being locked in a room. They may be restricted into who they can talk to, pressured or not allowed to have a job, or maybe they're restricted from going back to school, or they may even be restricted in their movements throughout the day or forced into isolation. The bottom line is coercive control is oppressive, and it's very damaging and can cause significant harm to a victim who doesn't realize it's taking place. Coercive control lays the foundation for domestic abuse, and children living in these homes are at greater risk of living where there's physical abuse as well. I want to make a note before moving on that coercive control is commonly seen in relationships where there are trauma bonds. And we have a workshop on trauma bonds that can be found on our website and on our YouTube channel. Something interesting that I'd like to note for you to think about for a moment is that if these things I just mentioned were done to a stranger, they would be considered a crime. But when it happens in an intimate relationship, it's more likely to not be perceived as criminal by people on the outside or by the victim on the inside. So there are laws that are coming into effect regarding coercive control. The UK is now actually prosecuting and sentencing those guilty of coercive control. And I see a movement towards that in the US, but we're still way behind. So today we're looking at coercive control with a special spotlight on how it impacts children and empowering parents to actually help their children who are experiencing and witnessing coercive control in their homes. So I want to ask you a question. Have any of you experienced coercive control? Or do you know a client who has? And if you have, if you're willing to share with us, I'd like to know, we'd all like to know the way that you experienced it. And remember, it can be really subtle. It doesn't have to be some of the overt examples that I mentioned. And so you can do that by placing it in the chat now, and then we'll have Jill read off some of your comments.
Yes, we will let you place those in the chat, and then I will share them with Annette. If any,
Jill, can you turn up your volume just a little bit?
Oh yeah, you know, it's all the way up. I wonder if
maybe it's on my end.
Okay, well, I'll just project.
Okay.
Okay. If anybody is feeling like unsure about sharing things in the chat, please know you can send a direct message to hosts and panelists or select my name from the drop-down menu, and I'll be happy to read it. And everything is read anonymously, just to affirm and assure everybody. Okay, we do have some coming in. I'm going to go ahead and share with you, Annette. Okay, the first one. Yes, a client of mine is told they have to throw out Easter baskets given to her by a family member. When she retrieved it later, he forced her to throw out all her fan gear and the Easter basket.
Yeah.
Yes, I was married to someone who used this, someone who experienced everything that you listed. And I think that is it for now. Oh, here comes another one. Sometimes we like to give a couple minutes because they're a little bit longer. So here's another one, Annette. My spouse refuses to discuss several important topics that need solutions. All discussions somehow turn to chaos. At the end, there are no solutions, and I'm unaware of what just took place.
Oh, I just can so relate to that. And if you would reach out to us at the end through email, just you can email me directly, Annette@themendproject.com or info@themendproject.com. I'd like to talk to you about some training opportunities that will really help you unravel what's happening, because it's so common to be utterly confused and hardly even remember what started the argument in the first place, because this is what perpetrators do. They block your ability to have an authentic conversation that moves to solutions. They reverse the blame. It's utter chaos, just like you mentioned. And in our we have a training cohort that's meant to really help responders get a comprehensive view of what it is to experience emotional abuse and to help victims and survivors. Okay, so thank you for your comments. That really, it helps us get engagement and get a little bit of insight into where you're coming from. Over the years, we've heard several stories and received numerous questions from victims who are in marriages or survivors who are co-parenting with an abusive partner, and their children are exposed to coercive control and abuse. Some of them aren't sure how to help their child deal with the abusive parent, and some consider escaping to get freedom from the coercive control and emotional abuse, but they aren't sure if they'll go through with it because they feel them leaving would tear the family apart or leave the child exposed to more abuse at least 50% of the time. Some wonder how they can help their child stand up for themselves and so forth, especially if they're not present with them. Historically, it's been said that children are exposed to or they witness domestic violence when it's happening, whether it's emotional abuse or physical violence. So they're witnessing it happening to an adult in the home. However, I think it's so important to understand that a child living in a home where coercive control or abuse is happening is a child who is a victim of abuse. And Dr. Christine Cocciola, who's a clinician that I'm going to quote from quite a bit today, she's also a coach who specializes in the traumatic experiences of adult and child victims of coercive control, is someone whose work I really respect. And so you're going to hear her name come up a few times. She works to support protective parents. So the protective parent is the non-controlling parent, the parent who's trying to have an empathic and secure attachment with everyone in the household. And it's the abusive spouse that is emotionally unavailable and in addition to being abusive and is not going to have a safe attachment. And so the protective parent wants to help the child navigate how to process coercive control. And the protective parent really wants to know how to parent their child where there is coercive control if they're not in a position to leave. In fact, she doesn't believe adult domestic violence should be treated separately from children. This is Dr. Cocciola, who, let me say that because I just inserted myself, but she doesn't believe that adult domestic violence should be treated separately from children who live in the same home, but rather all in one category, as domestic violence toward a spouse is actually happening to the family as a whole. And I agree with Dr. Cocciola in this belief. I've seen it firsthand and with so many victim stories, in addition to so many victim stories that I've worked with. On her website, Dr. Cocciola provides a flow chart to define what is actually happening to the children in a home environment where coercive control is happening. And I'm going to talk through each part of the chart. So we're going to put it up on the screen at this time and would like to ask you to take a screenshot with your phone or your computer so that you can follow along with me as I speak, because I'm going to refer to this flow chart quite a bit. And I'm not going to keep it on the screen as I go through it. So Dr. Cocciola notes on her website that this flow chart can be used by protective parents in their search for a qualified therapist or court professional for themselves or for their children. So if that's you, I highly recommend you head to her website for more information. And I'll disclose that in a little bit. Okay, so children who are born into a family where coercive control is taking place are surely impacted, and they'll not be able to go through life unfazed. It will, in one way or another, shape who they are, how they view themselves, which is so critically important, how they view each individual parent and others, and ultimately how they grow up to interact with the world around them. If you are here today and have experienced or are experiencing coercive control in your home, the children in the home have experienced the same abuse that you've experienced. Now, that falls under the category of adult child pre-trauma. So a child may have pre-trauma experience if born into a family with the coercive controller. That's where it is on the flow chart. The next point I want to talk about is traumatic events occur, where covert and overt abuse are taking place over a duration of time. When traumatic events occur during childhood over a duration of time, the result is developmental trauma. And if any of you want to look into this a little bit more, there's a lot of really valuable information on developmental trauma disorder. It's a proposed new diagnosis to the DSM-5. It has not yet been adopted, but it's been promoted by a consortium of psychiatrists and psychologists. So I encourage you to Google developmental trauma disorder because it's really informative. Okay, the other thing besides developmental trauma is betrayal trauma and cognitive dissonance or disassociation. So they actually become blind to the betrayal. And then complex post-traumatic stress disorder. But developmental trauma disorder is a proposed diagnosis to replace complex post-traumatic stress disorder in the developmentally aged child. Okay, so developmental trauma disorder through the amygdala and the hippocampus is basically the amygdala becomes overstimulated and the hippocampus underdeveloped. And so you have this distorted development in the brain, and it's really harmful. So you have this hyperactive amygdala and this not so active hippocampus. And for those who, I'm just going to briefly say that an amygdala would be like the accelerator in a car. It recognizes danger and it reacts. And it's where your fight, flight, freeze, trauma responses come from. And then the hippocampus is kind of like the brake in the car that helps to regulate the emotions. So you have this overactive or oversized amygdala. It actually increases in size in these traumatized children in the development, when their brain is developing. So it distorts proper brain development, and then an undersized hippocampus. If the betrayed person is a child and the betrayer is a parent, it is especially essential the child does not stop behaving in such a way that will inspire attachment. For the child to withdraw from a caregiver, he is dependent on what would further threaten his life, both physically and mentally. So the trauma of child abuse, by the very nature of it, requires that information about the abuse be blocked from mental mechanisms that control attachment and attachment behavior. So it gets quite complex and it is quite harmful. The far-reaching effects coercive control in the home has on the lives of victims and children really can't be overstated. And I think I've made that point by just really demonstrating how it alters brain development. It also is highly traumatizing to the adult parent. And we talk a lot about abuse and trauma here at the MEND Project because trauma is actually at the heart behind why we do the work that we do. Okay, the next area in the flow chart is unacknowledged by systems. So that would be family court, child protective services, the criminal justice system, even advocates, and many clinicians will inadvertently not acknowledge coercive control at its face and therefore not acknowledge the harm that it's actually causing. So by systems that are not acknowledging this, it equals more betrayal trauma. And the result is the trauma is complex and compounded. Too often, so let me just pause on that for a second. When a victim, whether it's a child or an adult, reaches out for help and someone steps in as an advocate or CPS or some type of person who's perceived as being an authority and knowledgeable, when that person harms the child by minimizing the effects of coercive control, it's actually even more traumatizing on the child and on the adult, because then they get to a place where they feel hopeless and in despair, which triggers complex post-traumatic stress. So that secondary layer of harm that happens by people in positions of authority can have significant impact. And it's really important that you as a clinician, if you're here as a clinician, understand how powerful your role is, because they perceive you to be in a position of authority and knowledge. Too often, when the protective parent begins to see what is happening and how it's impacting the child, they enact a plan to get themselves and their children help. Many of the systems that are in place will fail the child. And we hear this a lot from those of you who are connected to MEND in our workshops and our courses. An example of this is the family court system. The abusive parent may use the children against the parent who they have harmed. And the courts will miss that this is happening. And if the one who's being harmed actually claims abuse, they're often portrayed, the court perceives them as trying to exaggerate a situation and trying to alienate the other parent. And so it can have really harmful results in court. So at this point, the original trauma experienced by the child is compounded and escalated into complex post-traumatic stress. And this is partially due to how children and their protective parents carry that reasonable expectation that the courts will enact a just solution to their ongoing abuse. If or when the opposite occurs, it leaves the victim feeling like there's no hope. And that's where I made a statement already. Hopelessness and despair exacerbates trauma. It's very common for children to become the weapon the abuser uses to exert coercive control over their partner. And it's heartbreaking for both the parent being harmed and the children who are also victims. The abusive parent may employ tactics to drive the victim and children against each other. And this is so common. I can't tell you how many victim parents that we walk alongside at MEND who are estranged from their adult children because of this form of alienation. And usually the coercive controlling parent has been making comments to the kids throughout the entire relationship, unbeknownst to the victim or protective parent. And so they're blindsided by how they choose the perpetrators, how the child or adult children will choose the perpetrator's side. So we've had many women share their grief with us over broken relationships with their children after staying in an abusive marriage. And it's so harmful. And it's harmful for the kids because they now don't have that parent in their life who actually is working on a secure attachment. So it's very disorganized and disruptive. The victim protected the harmful parent, in the past, or downplayed abusive situations to the children, not wanting to constantly point the finger at the abuser. And in contrast, in varying ways, the abusive parent has gotten the child or children to believe that the true victim is crazy or mean, reactive, or controlling, or has a mental health issue. And once the protective parent has separated and left the relationship, the coercive controller sees them as all bad and will do anything to teach the children that in this all bad, all good relationship that compromises the relationship with a protective parent. And the coercive controller who is inflicting the harm will say and do anything to establish parental alienation between the victim and children. They use triangulation by creating conflict in the primary parental relationship and then attempting to get the child's alignment. This places the child in a position to choose which parent they will side with and where they stand. And this harmful dynamic eventually creates an enmeshed relationship with one parent and withdrawal from the other. And as you can imagine, they don't want to be on the bad side of the coercive controller. So often they choose to align with that parent. And often the coercive controller has control of the purse strings and they want the creature comforts that affords them. The children are put in the middle. And of course, the child wants to try to be on the good side of this coercive controller. while the protective parent is rejected or abandoned. The children in their developmental brain doesn't recognize what is happening, and they become blind to the betrayal. There is that cognitive dissonance. And because there's been so much betrayal trauma that has occurred over the course of the relationship, they're disassociated from feelings of betrayal. They don't have the intuition to recognize it. And so their compliance with the coercive controller is basically an act of survival. They will believe bad things about the protective parent because the protective parent isn't a threat. They're actually the safe parent. And it's painful and heartbreaking. All of this ultimately undermines the child's relationship with the protective parent and disrupts healthy attachment and causes trauma. So the next phase in the flowchart is manifestations of trauma. So this could be emotional duress, it could be fear, false beliefs and false narratives, avoidance of reality and ego compromised, dysregulation manifested in multiple ways, including anxiety, anger, sadness, fawning, and dissociation. Innocent children who are in the throes of coercive control taking place at home experience its harmful effects. These children often experience emotional distress and duress and are filled with fear, whether or not it's apparent. They are holding on to that fear. They may also be dysregulated in their trauma and experience anxiety, anger, or sadness, or they may disassociate and avoid the reality of their feelings as being related to the abuse that they're experiencing. And they're highly likely to have signs and symptoms of trauma. They may exhibit behavior changes. They may inflict self-harm or become emotionally and physically abusive towards their parents or a sibling or even others. Or they may have trouble in their social groups. Dr. Coercive says that behavior is the language of trauma. I think that's worth repeating. Behavior is the language of trauma. Our child will show us how they feel before they tell us how they feel. It can be difficult to know what to do for the children as a parent who has been harmed by coercive control and is on their own healing from trauma. The victim of abuse might be fearful to leave because of the high level of coercive control and what the abusive parent could potentially do, whether that's through retaliation or basically the victim has this anticipatory fear that more trauma is to come and they can't quite imagine what the other partner would be capable of. The protective parent and children who escape violence may face more abuse for a time, for example, with legal bullying, among many other things. Or the protective parent may have child support withheld from them and have to go on government support and find a way to make ends meet, which can feel impossible in light of all the trauma, the exhaustion, and responsibility of it all. Or they may be threatened with child welfare interventions or end up co-parenting with an abusive ex-partner who doesn't uphold the parenting agreements. And I understand the many thoughts and feelings and what ifs that one experiences when considering leaving, because they have no way of knowing, and they're already so triggered. So there may be more challenges for a time, but if done with a strong support system, separating from an abusive partner and parent has a strong potential to salvage the adult victim's life and the life and health of their developmentally aged children and the relationships with their children. Dr. Coercive, along with many of our victims and survivors, say it wasn't until 20 years later that they realized how he had undermined the victim. How I'm saying there are male victims as well, but just for simplicity, I'm going to use the male pronoun to represent abusers and female for victims. So sometimes victims will say that it wasn't until many years later that they realized how their spouse had undermined her relationship with the kids from the get-go, making disrespectful comments at the dinner table, privately making comments. I'm praying for your mom because she's emotionally unstable, or things of that nature, any way to undermine that other parent. And they didn't realize the harm that staying with the abuser all those years had on their children until many years down the road when their children were grown. It tends to come out when they are older and they've developed stronger voices themselves. So what is so hard for many of these survivors is their relationship with their children has been tarnished for various reasons, and it is so painful. Sometimes the abusive parent has fed the children lies they believed about the parent who's being harmed. And other times the children may grow up resenting the parent who is being harmed for not protecting them. Or the grown children may mimic the same behaviors the abuser parent uses that undermine and minimize the protective parent. So they gang up on them for fear that if they don't enact controlling behaviors themselves, they'll end up on the receiving end of the abuse. Or if the parents separate, they may choose to align with the abuser and want little to do with the parent who's been harmed. And the reasons are varied. If this has been the experience that you've had as a parent who's recovering, healing, and restoring, I just want to say that myself and my team are sorry for the pain that you've been experiencing or are experiencing with your children. It's an overwhelming sense of loss, and we empathize with you. It's so hard. So please hear me when I say this. You did the best that you could at the time with the information that you had. And I want to say that again, and please hear this. You did the best that you could at the time with the information you had. And there is hope for you. And before I address the parents who are currently in the home with their young children, I want to pause for a moment and see if there's any questions at this point that I can address at this time, because I know I've shared a lot. So do we have any questions? Just go ahead and put them in the chat.
Hi, Annette. So Jill has had a small technical issue that's knocked her out of the meeting. She's trying to get back on, but until then, you have me. That being said, we do have a few questions. How do you help your kids so the impact isn't so bad? It's concerning how harmful it can be, and how do we help as the other parent?
One thing that comes to mind, because I don't have specifics from you, but let's say that the controlling parent does something mean-spirited or doesn't really support the child emotionally if they're sharing something. Rather than disparaging that parent, the protective parent can say, honey, I know that was really hard, but I want you to know that when you talk to me, I'm going to listen, and I'm going to listen as long as you need me to, and I'm going to support you. I love you, and I will always be here for you. So it's basically allowing the child to see, without saying disparaging comments that might cause the child to feel caught in the middle, or that they need to defend the abusive parent, because that's our natural response. When we hear something bad about a family member, we want to defend them. And so if the protective parent avoids that, but just re-emphasizes how they will behave and demonstrate those behaviors, then that is, to me, the best way to develop a secure attachment with that child that will really take root over time. A secure attachment is what we all aim for with our kids. But I want to take a moment to also emphasize how hard it is for a traumatized parent to regulate themselves when their child may be acting out. It's really hard when you have trauma to serve the needs of your child's trauma. So that's another reason to try to exit the situation so that you can heal and be fully available to your child. Okay, do we have any other questions? That was a good question.
We do have a couple. So how do you teach your children healthy habits while living in the chaos of coercive control?
I think that what you do is you model back. So obviously it's complex and every situation is unique. No two situations are alike. But if your abusive spouse is being condescending, jokes at your expense, I'm just grabbing that as an example. It's so important to model boundaries. And I'm not saying to put yourself in danger, but just to say, when you talk to me that way, I'm going to exit the conversation, because we don't talk that way to people. And by just defining without saying you're a jerk, and then modeling to the kids later, I'm sorry that you had to hear that at the dinner table. We talk to each other respectfully, and just clarifying what good behavior is, without saying your dad's a jerk or whatever, that will model for the kids. And by them seeing you set a boundary, it will model for them boundaries for those types of behaviors. Does that answer your question? Oh, sorry, it's in the chat. Go ahead and go on to the next question.
So another one of our questions is, what resources are available to parents who are currently being victimized by their partners in the system?
Well, I need a little more specific of what kinds of resources you're looking for. I always recommend tapping into your local domestic violence agency, even if there's not physical abuse, because oftentimes they offer classes. And if they don't offer classes at your closest DV agency, reach out to larger cities. They have, in California, there's a class called PEP, P-E-P, Personal Empowerment Program. That's a really good class for victims to take, that just helps them gain more agency, more empowerment. We have an excellent training that will give victims a comprehensive view of what they're experiencing. And we say here at the Men Project that clarity is the first necessary step to healing. They need to be able to name and define those manipulative behaviors that are being employed against them. And so we have a number of tools, and we teach how to use them in our training. So I highly recommend that. And there's also legal advocacy organizations. It's different in every area. And believe it or not, the National Domestic Violence Hotline has answers to many questions. It's pretty comprehensive. And they have advocates who answer calls and can really help a victim in an immediate situation. And you can always email us, and we answer every email if there's a situation that you're encountering. But if you need a more specific list of resources, feel free to email me and define what you're looking for. Because there's podcasts that victims can listen to that will really educate them. There's books to read. There's so many ways to help a victim gain that clarity, which is so essential. Do we have any more questions?
Well, I think we'll hold for now, just in the sake of time, and allow you to continue, and then we'll come back.
Okay, we'll get to them at the end. Okay, so now I'm going to address parents who are currently in a marital relationship where coercive control is taking place. You have the opportunity to be a life raft as the protective parent. The protective parent carries this beautiful gift with the ability to help their child or children live a life free from abuse. So going back to the chart, protective parent prepared, responsive versus reactive, lending calm, intentionality, listening and being present, validating, attuned, and consistent, building trust. The protective parent is perceived as different from the coercive controller. The protective parent is perceived as being safe, and the coercive controller is perceived by the children to be unsafe. If you can really work on self-regulation, really work on your trauma, so that you can be there when your child is, remember, Dr. Cocciola said that behavior is the language of trauma. So when your child is acting out in these random ways, maybe even against you, you will not react. You will have the ability to stay calm, get down on your child's level, and ask them, what's going on? Talk to me, and talk them off the cliff. Because you won't be servicing your own trauma. It's so important to get to that place of healing where you can be present, really emotionally present for your traumatized child. The protective parent who has themselves been harmed needs to really make an effort to work on their own trauma. It's essential to respond more than react. And when a child acts out defiantly, the protective parent really needs to be calm and loving. So you're always showing that you unconditionally love your child. You can also set and hold boundaries, but they need to be done in a loving way. And children who go between co-parents living in separate households, they may be in survival mode with the coercive controller. And they let it out when they return to the protective parent. And so even in those situations, when your child comes back and they're bouncing off the couches and they're acting out and they're being rude, it's important to remain calm and to not disparage the other parent, but to have an intentional conversation about, I don't mean to interrogate your child, but to just say, I'm sorry for what has upset you, but I am here for you. I'm here to listen, and I love you. And you just keep reinforcing that you are available along with your own behavior, remaining calm. So as the protective parent listens, they need to be sure to validate their child. So if your child opens up to you and says something disparaging about the other parent, you haven't said it, but you can validate your child. Validate their perspective if you think it's accurate. This is a little bit of a sidebar. A child who is confused between this kind of chaos, they have a harder time of trusting their own objectivity and perspectives. And so they actually need a safe adult, a primary caregiver, to validate their perceptions. So when they tell you something and it sounds accurate to you, it's so important to validate them so that it will eliminate that cognitive dissonance, where if you didn't validate them, they might say, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't understand, or, oh, just ignore it. And there's this dissociation or cognitive dissonance that takes place. And you can really help build a strong foundation of values in your child and safety with you as you talk through these things. So it's really important to stay attuned to your child. You want to create safety so that you actually help your child start to self-regulate, process what happened, and deal with their emotions. And this will really help with your own attachment to your child. And if you don't understand attachment, I really encourage you to Google that and educate yourself. Or I should have a book that I could refer you to, but I think it's something really important for all parents to understand how critical that is to your child's mental health and well-being. Okay, moving on to the chart. The protective parent acknowledges harms or gives clarity when opportunities arise. The focus is on authentically elevating self. And disparaging the coercive controller is not helpful. So you want to elevate yourself in terms of being a safe parent. I am a safe parent, and I'm going to show you how I'm a safe parent and how you can trust this relationship without disparaging the other parent. Now, if your child is dead on and names what the unsafe parent did, validate it, absolutely. But I just don't want you, and Dr. Cocciola doesn't want you to be in a situation where you are bringing your concerns to the child because you want the child to align with you. That is really destructive, and it's going to undermine your relationship with the child. Okay, it's important for the protective parent to acknowledge the harm that's been done, helping their child have clarity when the opportunity presents itself. Clarity is the first step to healing, and that goes for children too. The protective parent will help the child focus on an authentic sense of self, building self-esteem and self-value. And I want to make a quick note about the protective parent acknowledging the harm that's been done. It's important to not engage in this tit for tat behavior, even if your other partner is doing that. It's important to not respond, to show that you are stable and consistent. And if the child felt abused or afraid, again, acknowledge those feelings, acknowledge that it is scary. And I don't blame you for being afraid. Don't minimize their feelings. Don't say, oh, your father would never hurt you. Don't minimize their feelings. You want to validate their feelings because their perspective is actually probably accurate. And so it's so important for, while they're feeling undermined, while there's chaos and confusion on one end, you're there to validate that. And always listen to your feelings as well. And treat those as important too. So I would also say to your child, you know, I'm so sorry that happened. But where you and I are concerned, I want to always listen. And if I don't listen to you, remind me that I'm not listening. And I will pay attention to your feelings, and I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong for having feelings. I'm going to remember to listen to you. And I'm here to support you because I love you unconditionally and I want you to feel safe. Conversations like that are just so important. But you have to back it up with remaining calm. And if you blow it and you are reactive, it's so important to calm yourself down. And when you are, to go in and apologize to that child and tell them that what you did was wrong, and that, you know, you can just briefly describe what you were experiencing, but bring the focus back to the child's needs and how your reaction affected the child. Okay, back to the chart. Child is questioning and begins to self-disclose. So they're questioning, they're removing a little bit away from cognitive dissonance, and they're starting to question what's happening. And they start to disclose to themselves that maybe something is off. The child is open to receiving affirmations, unconditional positive regard, connection, and support. So the protective parent will work to create a child-centered environment that is calm, gentle, and without judgment. And when I say judgment, I want to emphasize that what an abuser does is when you express your feelings, that hurt me, or I'm really concerned about something, and I'd like to talk to you about how I feel about it. Your feelings are judged by the abuser. You shouldn't feel that way, or that's ridiculous, you're too sensitive. They judge you rather than give you space, space to have a place in the conversation where your feelings are heard and validated. That does not take place in an abusive situation. There's always chaos when you raise a complaint, a concern, or a request. So we don't want to do that to our children. We want to give them positive support by way of affirmations. When you see them doing something positive, that's different than how their abusive parent would act. Affirm them, unconditional positive regard. And then they actually will begin to work on healthy relationship dynamics with the protective parent. And this can also be done with a clinician. I am very much in support of getting therapeutic help if you can. And sometimes you can get really low cost therapeutic help through domestic violence agencies. I know the one locally here, it's basically you pay what you can afford to receive domestic violence counseling. So there are resources that I encourage you to seek out. If your child is coming to you with the behavior that's similar to the coercive controller, or if they're approaching you with accusations, you can listen to them, have a gentle tone, show empathy. So you want to model empathy. And when necessary, you can come up with a statement or two that will help to not add to their emotion. You can say things like, "That's not true. I don't agree," especially if they're falsely accusing you of something that, let's say, their abusive parent falsely accused you of. And if they don't stop, you can choose to disengage with them gently. And this can look like saying, like, I'm not going to call back the gal who called me earlier today now, or I need to use the restroom. Like you just, no, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. I'm going to call back you don't have to say, I'm not going to talk to you. You can say, I need to go make a phone call. I'm going to make that. And I will talk to you again a little later. Or I need to use the restroom, like something to give yourself a little space so that you are not arguing with your child, but you did make a clear statement. I don't agree. That's not true. Or you can say, I'm going to head out for my walk a little early today so I can start dinner earlier, and just not engage in an argument. And similar comments will show that you're not going to entertain a conversation of false accusations. If they persist and demand your attention, invite them to join you on your walk. You can process things a lot more calmly when you're going for a walk, or say that we can talk later at a specific time. As a parent, you don't need to fix every problem they come to you with. It's okay for you to pause and come back to it later when everyone calms down a little bit. And it's helpful to model for them placing a boundary that you're not going to have a heated conversation. Okay, back to the chart. Intervention focused on education of healthy relationship dynamics with protective parent and or clinical support. The child begins to build towards regulation, processing of emotions, and ego resiliency. Child-centered, you want to be child-centered, child's choice, gentle, calm, slowly without judgment, and with attunement, knowing when your child is ready. You're really tuning into their feelings. The child then gains clarity, reignited attachment and agency with the protective parent. And your child begins to create their own narrative so that they can see things the way they, more objectively, they can view, I have this role model, I have this role model. So they begin to create their own narrative in their mind that's not the narrative of the abusive parent. And it's not a narrative that you are imposing on them. You are modeling your behavior, and you are validating them. You are affirming them. You are helping them gain clarity. So they begin to create their own narrative, which is it becomes a more accurate narrative. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is post-traumatic growth. The goal in the child disclosing is to help them feel grounded and safe. If you need to provide some level of education to the child, that's okay. It will help them gain clarity, with which, like I said, and I'll say it again, is the first necessary step to healing. In the relationship with the protective parent, they build towards regulation, processing their emotions in a safe place. And sometimes kids need to talk out their emotions, and you need to be there to listen to them, to not minimize them, to affirm them, to validate them, and to stay calm. And I know I've said that a few times, but you are essential in helping them regulate their emotions and to come up with an accurate narrative. So you want to help them learn to identify their inner voice, their intuition, their objectivity, their perception, and you want to use personal agency. And you want them to develop personal agency. You want them to experience ego resiliency and create the narrative of their own personal story that they can rely on. Trust is built as a child is gaining and exercising personal power and personal choice, using their voice, all in a calm and safe relationship without judgment with the protective parent. So this process results in a more secure attachment, which I know I've said is so important, to the protective parent, and ultimately post-traumatic growth, where they no longer endure distress, or where they can view distressing situations by not engaging in the chaos, because they have seen you model the proper perspective and how to respond. So you're helping them find their own narrative through your modeling and through your words. So I hope that makes sense. The brain may have been traumatized and dysregulated. And when the child's, well, even the adult, when there's recurring trauma, these deepened neural pathways form. But by consistently being attuned and supportive and loving and calm towards your child, this traumatized and dysregulated brain, because of neuroplasticity, means that the brain can heal and your child can begin to rebuild and strengthen a secure attachment with you. The protective parent will be perceived as very different from the coercive controller. The protective parent will be perceived as safe. And secure attachment is characterized by feelings of trust, emotional availability, which is essential, and emotional and physical safety. A parent who is available, emotional, and fully present with their child will validate their child, help their child make sense of their feelings. And a parent who delights in their child and takes interest in what they are involved in and what they enjoy, all these things will help a parent create a secure attachment with their child. Your child needs to have a sense of autonomy. And so activities where they can experience successes and failures where you support them is so essential for them to gain their own sense of agency. So I want this to be your highest goal, to have a secure attachment with your child. Even as you're healing, work on building this strong attachment. Put your needs secondary and be mindful to not involve your child in your problems, and be steadily there as they make sense of their world and freely explore the world at large. So I'd like to give you an example of what validation looks like. Let's say your child wants to go to Disneyland and you don't have the finances to pay for it. Rather than saying, no, we can't afford it, say that's very dismissive. It's not really hearing what your child is really hoping for. And so I'd rather you say something to your child like, I know how much you'd love to go to Disneyland. And I want you to know that so would I. I would love nothing more than to spend the day with you there. I need you to understand that Disneyland is very expensive and we can't afford it at this time. But we can start saving for a trip by putting a little money each month into our Disneyland savings jar. I mean, if that's possible for you, that's an alternative. And you can tell them, I'm not sure how long it will take, but I'll commit to adding to the jar. So I also encourage you to think about ways you can contribute to the jar. maybe walking the neighbor's dog, watering their yard, or selling old toys, and so forth. Even if you don't come up with a savings plan, merely slowing down and acknowledging your child's feelings rather than abruptly dismissing or minimizing them will go a long way in terms of the child feeling seen and heard and valued. And that's so important. So for those of you who are working with a clinician, it's imperative that the clinician meet the following requirements. And this guide can also be found on Dr. Cocciola's website as a resource. And now I'm going to give you the website. It's www.coercivecontrolconsulting.com. Coercivecontrolconsulting.com. So let me, these are basically requirements. Have an interest in advocate. This is for a clinician's requirements, that they have an interest in advocating for victims and survivors on all levels. And advocating might mean outside of the therapeutic session. It might mean making a call to a DV agency or accompanying them to an attorney's office. It requires a little more than just talk therapy. They need to be number two is they need to be trauma trained with experience working with victims and survivors. And number three, they need to have an understanding of coercive control, really understand it as an additional layer to the trauma of living in a family system with an abuser. And for those clinicians out there who are struggling with really understanding this, we offer 9.5 continuing education units through one of our trainings through the APA. And IVAT is our co-sponsor, but you can find it on our website. And I think you'll really learn a lot and enjoy the class. The number four, understand that children need to be educated on what unconditional love and positive regard are, and that every child deserves to feel this and the ability to be authentic with one of their caretakers. Number five, understand that the two-parent model is not best for children when one parent is a coercive controller. The therapist needs to understand that most coercive controllers have a pathology that cannot be healed, or that they have no interest in working on healing, and that coercive controllers are often able to hide who they truly are. They act very different. They're very charming oftentimes with clinicians and other outsiders, while they're very different behind closed doors. So it's helpful to know the position of the therapist on how coercive control impacts children in the family system before you continue on with them. Again, this information is pulled from Dr. Cocciola's website, specifically in her free resources. This one is titled A Guide for Interview Questions for Hiring Therapists or Court Professionals for Children Who Have Been Coercively Controlled. And this particular guide for hiring a therapist has more helpful information than I covered. So I encourage you to go and take a look at that. And also, if you're engaging with a clinician or school professional counselor, physician, or other providers, it's important to know and keep in mind that providers are often hearing a false narrative about protective parents from the abusers. You have to just know that. And in the same token, it's so important to show up well, to remain calm, even though that can be so triggering. False accusations about a person are highly triggering. You're being slandered, you're being completely mischaracterized, but it's so important to remain calm. That said, protective parents benefit from sharing this helpful information with one person in the practice, what is really needed. And it's important to note that oversharing and giving too much information to too many people leads providers to actually being less trusting of the protective parent. The protective parent may actually come across as being a lot like the abuser, or desperate, and victim-like. So it's true that you may be desperate and you are a victim, but it's vital to not present in this way, according to Dr. Cocciola. Protective parents need to be child-focused and succinct, showing up differently than how they have been described. The protective parent needs to stay solely focused on the child's well-being. Consider how it is for the child who has to listen to the harmful parent disparage the protective parent, and even how the harmful parent may be imposing guilt on the child for loving the protective parent. If the protective parent remains focused on the child's interests in school, in sports, in art, and friendships, they'll be modeling to the child what safe interactions look and feel like. So that was a lot. And if you have any questions, we're going to take questions in a second. But before I wrap up for today, a lot of the information I shared with you can be found on Dr. Christine Cocciola's website. Jill has shared it in the chat earlier, and she'll place it in the chat, and I read it to you. And as always, it's such a privilege to work with so many incredible laborers in this field like Dr. Cocciola and bring educational workshops and resources to you. So I hope that you walk away with new insights, some new ideas and action steps, and feel equipped and empowered to parent your child or children's their needs and what they deserve. And even if these are adult children, still remaining child-focused can be so helpful in reestablishing relationships with estranged adult children. We believe in you at the Men Project. We believe in you as responders. We're here to help you. No question is stupid. Just please, this is a safe place. So I hope that you will pose your questions. And then, and for you victim survivors, I believe in healing. Health is yours. So many people have gone before you, and they have successfully navigated through this process. You're in a tough season, but there is hope, and we want to help provide you hope and provide you help on your journey. Okay, so thank you, and I will take your questions now.
All right, so do you have any observations, thoughts on kids and counselors? Our kids are 10, 11, and 13, can get things back. Or do you have any observations or thoughts on how kids counselors or kids are 10, 11, and 13 can get things backwards, effectively leading a counselor to reinforce the belief in a child that the protective parent is actually the abusive parent and creating a more self-doubt and confusion in the kids' minds?
Oh, it happens all the time. It's so sad. But what happens often is that the protective parent is traumatized. This is just one example. And so they tend to react, and they might yell. They might even throw something. But their motives are not to power over and control. They are so traumatized that they have limited resources, limited mental resources to tap into. So they go into the fight, flight, or freeze, or a fawning or appeasing mode. And that clinician often doesn't recognize the signs of trauma. They haven't dug a little deeper to really understand what is happening. And the reactive parent may not understand all the coercive control. They may only understand parts of it. So they get very sucked into these chaotic dynamics because they don't recognize the other manipulative behaviors that are being employed against them. That's why clarity is so important, so they can anticipate the patterns and not engage in them. But yes, I so often see in the courts and where clinicians are testifying that the victim is actually the abuser. And abusers, I'm in the state of California, and we have a law here that if the primary bread earner can prove that the other parent is abusive, they won't have to pay alimony. So many abusers claim that the victim is the abuser. And a lot of abusers believe the victim is the abuser. She's not meeting his every need and desire. She's not behaving as a submissive spouse is supposed to. And so therefore she's the abusive one. And she's reacting, so she's abusive. They believe it and they advocate and they fight for that. So yes, unfortunately, it happens a lot. Next question.
What about children and you're still in the relationship with a controller? I don't leave and she sees this. How much can you tell your children?
Okay, depending on the age of your child, okay, I personally think it's not helpful to disparage the other parent unless the children really get it and they come to you and they say, I'm so afraid of dad or mom, whoever the abuser is, and they're abusive, or please leave. We don't want to live with that person anymore. If they really have clarity that that other person is harmful, then I think, depending on their age, I wouldn't do this younger than 6th grade, you can actually start teaching them without discussing the other parent. You can start teaching them our terms and definitions to describe I can never say that word, manipulative behaviors. I should be able to say that word. I have to say it a lot, but anyways, for them to be able to name and define, for example, minimization or blame shifting or lying or scapegoating. And there's so many more terms, but by teaching your children to be able to identify the patterns being used against them, you're actually increasing their emotional IQ. They are now gaining the proper language to make sense out of what's happening. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, as long as you are not trying to say your dad is and putting your needs on them. It's more important to model safe behavior and to not get into that disparaging situation. It's the same thing if a clinician, if a patient or a client goes to a clinician and they're not sure that they're being abused, and they're just saying, we have really toxic communication patterns. And if the clinician over confronts that victim by saying, you're being abused, before the victim has really able to take that strong statement on, we call it over confronting. So you don't want to do that to a child before they are, you want to help them by modeling, discern for themselves what healthy and unhealthy, what safe and unsafe is. And then as they, from a wellspring inside themselves, start to see, then you can provide clarity. But I would be really careful about how you do that. And Dr. Cochiola has some classes, so there could be more information with better examples that you can glean from that or from her.
Yeah. So as a follow up on that, the children are adult children specifically.
Okay, definitely. If the children are willing to talk to you and they aren't telling you, Mom, I don't want to talk about dad. If they're willing to listen, then I think providing them legitimate data, and you can go to our website and download in PDF fashion our terms and definitions. By them seeing a credible organization defining these things, and you're not putting your own words, you are just showing them what this is and say, and also we have, I think it's on our website. If not, you can email us and we'll send you one. It's called The Maze of Confusion. It is the image of a maze as a metaphor for a conversation with a coercive controller. And it really illustrates how confusing it is, so that children can then deduce that they didn't see the signs, just as you as the victim didn't see them for years, because of how confusing and chaotic it is. And it really helps solidify the message, that the way that you want to educate them. So I'm all for that, but it depends on the receptivity of the adult child. I think if they aren't receptive, it's more important to really show up for them. Take them to breakfast once a week and say, tell me what's going on in your life, and just be there for them. Let them see you as somebody who's genuinely interested in their lives. You're interested in emotionally supporting them, and you don't have another agenda. Any other questions?
Yes, we do have a couple more. Is it recommended that the protective parent have more parenting time and limit the access to the abusive parent if possible? I've always believed in supporting a relationship with both parents, but I'm wondering if them having less time with the abuser is the better way to go.
I personally think that is definitely better. If you can do that and not get in trouble legally, I definitely think that's a better system. You want to limit their exposure to this chaotic behavior, if possible, because they're experiencing harm. They're experiencing emotional harm, and depending on their ages, they're not able to unravel it. It's traumatizing. Just being dysregulated, maybe they're not being harmed, but they're anticipating being harmed emotionally, or being manipulated and being confused. Confusion is stressful. So yeah, we don't want to increase trauma. So if there's a way that you can limit that, I do advocate for that.
How would a person 100% know if they are experiencing coercive abuse? My experience is that if I bring up a bad behavior, my spouse matches it with something I have done.
So that's called blame shifting. And so what I would do if I were you is I would go to our terms and definitions and download it and read through that and circle the ones that you've experienced, because you may identify more behaviors that you aren't identifying right now. And if there's just one behavior that's playing out over and over again, it can be destructive to a relationship. So just your example that you can't ever raise a reasonable complaint or concern without him one-upping you, that's obviously destructive. You can't have emotional intimacy if you're not mutually listening and mutually validating. But if there's just one or two, you can name that behavior to your partner. And if they're not an abuser, they will want to change because they'll want to be a good person. But an abuser may stop doing that behavior, but they're going to adopt other manipulative behaviors to stonewall the conversation. So it's easy to discern. But I think by you looking at the terms and definitions, you'll be able to identify other behaviors that maybe you haven't yet identified. But that in itself is an abusive act. It is an emotionally abusive act. Okay, I know we're so over time. Are there any more questions?
No, I think we're good for today.
Okay, I hope that last question, I hope that answered your question. Come to our training. That will be comprehensive. It's only 4 weeks long. It's about an hour of reading a week and a 1 to 2 hour session with me. And you will get so much knowledge about the mindset of the abuser, about your own thinking patterns, about what constitutes abuse, how to respond to things, how to set boundaries, so many valuable tools you'll glean from that training. All right, everyone, thank you for being here. I'm sorry I went over. And for those who had to leave early, I know you can access the complete video, including the Q&A later. So just thank you, and join us next time and go view our other workshops. Thank you for being here and have a great day.